Cool. We rolling then? Wicked. Right, well, we're in straight away.
Hello.
Judge Jules.
Hello.
Welcome. How are you?
All good. All good. I like that Northeast always adds an extra kind of syllable to my surname.
Jules.
Yeah, which I love.
I never even noticed because that's obviously how we speak.
Us Cockneys do it differently.
Jules.
I'm not the most Cockney kid on the block, but that's where I'm from, of course.
You're from Essex, right?
No, I'm from North London.
Oh, are you?
Yeah, from North London.
Oh, I thought you were from...
Born and raised in Crouch End, North London.
Right, okay. Right, well, I'm not going to lie. I'm probably... I said out to my wife on the way in, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to fanboy a little bit here because you were one of the first... When I was at school, when I was at college, you know, Judge Jules, you're the resident on Radio 1, Judgment Sundays. That was huge for me when I was younger.
Great.
So I'm
pleased to have been a bad influence on you.
Well, yeah. So anyway, I don't think you need an introduction, but we always ask a little bit who you are and what you do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the interesting thing about me is the fact that I now lead this dual life. So I've kind of done most things within the electronic music world. Historically, I've been a DJ for a long time, and much to my surprise, still an extremely busy DJ now, some nearly 40 years later. But I've also been a kind of promoter, run record labels, made records, as we all do, done remixes and stuff. But 12 years ago, not quite knowing what the future held in DJ land, I made the sort of decision to go back to school and retrain as a lawyer, and did it very quietly and surreptitiously because I didn't really want people to know at the time. Became a lawyer, so maybe I'm answering some of the questions prematurely that you don't really want me to answer so quickly. But
no, please
I am now, dare I say it, the world's only active artist and specialist music lawyer. I've got a partnership in my own practice. As you would imagine, I specialise in electronic music, although I do some other stuff as well. So I lead this kind of dual life of, well, I say DJ by night, but so many more things are daytime these days. But, you know, the metaphor sounds better. DJ by night, music lawyer by day.
Yeah, that's interesting because when we started speaking, I think it was about four years ago when I was going through something, we'll come on to it briefly and not in much detail, but I had some things going on in my career and I can't remember who I spoke to, it might have been another DJ, and they said, you should reach out to Jules. And I said, who's Jules? He went, you know, like Judge Jules, the DJ. And then it all clicked. I was like, oh, now it makes sense. But yeah, so your journey into music, so that was kind of a bit of a soundbite and a snapshot. But what's your early influences like? What, you know, how old were you when you really started to realize that music, whether it's going to be the legal side or the performance side or the production side, when did that really become, obvious that you're going to go down that route?
Well, I mean, I guess like everybody who's in the music business, I was into music like obsessively from as young as I can remember. I guess because I was my sort of formative years as a DJ, I started promoting illegal parties, and I did that for about 5 years. Bit of a strange contrast between being a lawyer now and doing that back in the day. But suffice to say, back in the day, it was a bit less illegal. A lot of the law got more stringent and more draconian subsequent to that. But I guess I started putting on events when I was 16. Because you've got this huge social circle when you're that age. You don't realise it when you're 16 to 18 or maybe 18 to 21, but that's the point in your life where you've got the largest social circle that you'll ever have in your life. Yeah. And we weren't necessarily thinking those sort of thoughts. We were just thinking we've got nowhere to go to, especially when we're in the younger years, when you're pre-18 and you're lucky enough to find certain venues are prepared to turn a bit of a blind eye to the fact that a lot of your crowd is very young. So I guess there was, I'm not 100% answering your question, but the issue, when do you know that you are going to make a full-time career out of music? I guess it's the point at which you can pay your rent and you can go down to Sainsbury's and pay for your shopping bill and pay all the other X's in your life. And it's actually an achievement. I think the biggest achievement in anybody in the music industry's life is when you can actually no longer have to work part-time, full-time, be a hobbyist, but actually make a full-time career out of it. And I guess for me, that was pretty much, I went to university, I actually got a degree in law, that's where the judge moniker came from as opposed to being a lawyer. Yeah. And when I came out of university, I was immediately able to support myself and didn't have to go and do a more sensible job. So I guess that would be the junction. That was at 21.
21. Yeah, I remember the reason I asked is because I remember going to Sankey's for the first time when I was 19. Sankey's in Manchester, for people who don't know. A club which is now sadly gone. I remember going in there and prior to that, I just DJed in my bedroom. I was happy playing for friends at parties and house parties. But then going there, I was in there in the basement, and I just said to my friend, I went, I'm going to fucking do this full time. And he was like, shut up and enjoy yourself. Like, just have fun. But I just knew, I knew that I wanted to be behind the stage. And now obviously looking back, strange reasons, I wanted the attention. I wasn't getting attention when I was younger, and all these things kind of come into play. But I just knew it was like a moment. And I'm interested because obviously I've followed your career from when I was at college and through, and I always interested to ask you that.
Well, I think in my case, because I started just before the so-called acid house explosion in the late 80s, and was quite instrumental in that in terms of playing some of the big illegal raves that are kind of the stuff of legend now. But because I started so early, there wasn't really a career as a DJ. If you like, I was one of the first DJs that actually did have an independent career as a DJ, as opposed to doing something, if you were lucky, doing another job in the music business and doing a bit of part-time DJing, or doing something completely different to being a part-time DJ. So when I started, it wasn't a realistic aspiration really to be a DJ. It was probably only 10 years later when people might have kind of looked at what others were doing, and that was a sensible agenda. I mean, thankfully, my dad was an actor and a TV director, so kind of a freelance type person all his life. And although at the time being a DJ wasn't considered a job, and most parents would be like, especially sort of in my environment where I went to a decent university and did fairly well academically, would have just laughed and said, what the hell are you doing? But because of where my dad had come from, a jobbing entertainer in a different sphere of the entertainment world, they were quite cool about it. And I think the support of your parents or otherwise is quite significant, of course, in that quest to do what you want to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a big part. I mean, I didn't really get that support from my parents. I think I remember being in a car park. I worked for Barclays Bank at the time. I think I was 21, and I'd been there for 3 years, and I just said, I don't want to do this. I was really starting to not gain traction. I was starting to play out more and kind of getting that hunger for it. 2 years since that Sankey's experience and going, this is what I want to do. And I remember going to an open day at Newcastle College and being sat in the car and went, I've got to have 1,500 quid to buy this course, which is an access to higher education course, because I didn't have any A-levels. I flunked all them. I called my dad, and he was abroad at the time, and I said, look, Dad, I need to lend the 1,500 quid to do this course. And he was just like, nah. So I was like, oh, fuck you then. I'm going to go and do it myself. And ended up like having 3 jobs. And I'm really glad I did it. It kind of taught me work ethic, I think, quite somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the elephant in my personal room with work ethic was that my mother died when I was 18. Okay. And that was just as I was just as I went to university. And whilst I was at university, I spent much more focus and much more time on promoting events than I did in my degree. But I think if you suffer bereavement, it's easy to kind of look back on it in retrospect. But, piecing together the way my mind worked and the way I reacted to what's a hugely traumatic situation was to just throw yourself into promoting parties, throw yourself into something different to kind of take your mind off the pain, dare I say it, that you're suffering. And I think I did quite well quite quickly, because I spent like every waking hour focusing on the parties I was putting on, and then as it rolled into other things, into pirate radio and eventually into making records, to kind of take my mind off other stuff that was going on in life.
Of course. So that was kind of that trajectory. That was the promoting parties, which was the kind of initial kind of foot in the water, if you like. Then it was pirate radio. Let's talk about that, pirate radio. What age were you when you started doing that? And because we spoke about it just briefly before we were recording, but you mentioned carrying records of
approximately. I was approximately 19 or 20, I think. I was on one fairly unsuccessful radio station that didn't have. You really needed to have some technical nous and some dodgy engineers to keep you on air, and they kind of didn't have that sufficiently. But then I joined the then pirate radio station, Kiss FM, a year or so later, and that was really significant for me, because Kiss at the time was completely different from the other pirate radio stations that existed, in that most of them were either playing reggae, or there were a couple that were kind of on the soul tip, whereas Kiss had DJs across the board, had really quirky DJs like Cold Cut, had really funky DJs like Soul to Soul, had some of the early acid house DJs like Danny Rampling, myself. And so it covered all the bases of Clubland, and no other pirate radio station at the time was doing anything close. And the rest is kind of history. It became legal in 1990. And that was a huge stepping stone. I think, radio's valuable for those who can be involved in it, because you become less of a faceless kind of DJ. I mean, I've always, then and now always consider myself sort of 51% a club and festival and event DJ and 49% a radio DJ, because my heart really lies in standing in front of a crowd. Those that have done it love it. It's a drug that you just can't get enough of. But it's a luxury at the same time to be able to kind of project your personality. Sounds wrong. That sounds really smashy and nicey, but to at least have a personality that transcends the tunes you play in front of people.
Absolutely. I think also on that about not projecting your personality, but that was almost a form of social media. So now you promote yourself by putting the 30-second clip of you playing an event and the big crowd going off. But back then, if you're on radio, that's another form of publicity for yourself, right? You're kind of.
Absolutely, especially in a smaller marketplace as well, because obviously now you've got, well, notwithstanding the fact you've got kind of broadband, high-speed internet, which sounds like something we've lived through our entire lives, but of course at that time it didn't exist. But there also weren't many radio stations. There were very few playing electronic music. I mean, Radio 1 really only had one show a week at the time, which wasn't mine. This is pre my going on Radio 1. So if you were lucky enough to be there early and know what you were doing and be a bit organised and actually love what you do, there was much more of an opportunity. It would be disingenuous and egotistical of me to suggest that it's as easy to break through now as it was then. Which isn't to say that you could fake it then, but there were so many less people in the playing field.
Yeah, it's a completely different landscape now. I talk to a lot of artists on here and actually off the podcast about the landscape in terms of how to promote yourself and how you have to pivot to this social media heavy industry, because there's no other way of really promoting yourself. And some of them find it difficult. I'm not going to mention names, but I've spoke to some friends who have said that they really struggle keeping up with the young'uns because these up and comings don't know any different. This is just how it is. So they've got a full-time videographer. They've got videos going up 2 or 3 times a week. Finished content costing a fortune. Yeah. And the ones that have got the revenue coming in to sustain that, it's great. But for the young people who are coming up, who are just like trying their best to do stuff on an iPhone camera,
yeah. I mean, it's either that or there are 1 or 2 exceptions who are so authentic in the way they sound. I mean, Ben Hemsley's a good example of somebody who sounds just so authentic on socials that I think he cuts through without necessarily having to kind of put that spend behind the kind of production of what he does. But I think it's the exception rather than the rule, where you're actually comfortable with just being really authentic and bearing your soul, because DJing and DJing as a whole is for a certain type of individual who's fundamentally quite shy, but then can kind of come alive in certain environments. And I think if you peel behind the onion of the personality of many, many DJs, that is the truth. So actually social media is not necessarily very comfortable for the majority, but it's a necessary evil, because how on earth do you stick your head above a very crowded parapet?
That's a really interesting point. And I've noticed that some of the people I was just talking about before saying that they struggle with the social media side of things because they don't want to go on camera and do the selfie videos, and they don't want to do the production side of things and the after movies and all that stuff, because it's just not them. But you've got to do it. That's the thing. It's a catch-22. You have to do that. But sorry, moving on. So radio-wise, obviously, Pirate was the initial. That was obviously the initial radio influence for you. How did that radio career progress? Because obviously, I know you from the Judge Jules on Radio 1 and the Essential Mix and all that stuff. So, how does that radio trajectory look? Because there'll be people who listen to this who want to get into radio.
No, of course. And I mean, I was on Radio 1 for 15 years, stopped being on there 10 years ago. Before then and since then, I've got a syndicated radio show, The Global Warm-Up, which is now on its 1056th episode.
Wow.
It's syndicated on lots of radio stations, sort of both domestically and globally. I guess with Radio 1, certainly when I joined the station, was the pinnacle of of any DJ's aspiration, because it was one of the few stations globally of any scale for whom playing new music was a virtue and not a liability, because of course most radio stations are commercial, are safe, are driven, are centrally owned by corporations, have got a running playlists, via focus groups. It's not a very organic, from the heart situation. It is it's quite a cold-hearted and businesslike. So to join Radio 1 was really the pinnacle of aspiration as a radio DJ, and it was very valuable to me as a career. It was also to be able, as DJs, what do we want to do? We want to enlighten people to the records we love. Sounds like I'm dumbing it down, dumbing it down to its basis, but that's what it's all about. So if you're able to do it on a whereby you're getting millions of listeners per show, that's the ultimate in doing that.
Yeah, the radio thing. I wrote this down as well. The radio thing was interesting for me because I've played gigs to thousands of people, as you will have, but I've played gigs to tens of thousands of people, and I went on Radio 1 twice with Danny Howard just to talk. Actually, no, that's a lie. The first time was to talk. I had some tracks coming out, and it was like a feature for a breakthrough artist, like something like that, and I was shitting myself. It was like a 5-minute segment. I was going to play an edit that I'd done, especially for the show, and it was a different type of nervous, and obviously it's because I hadn't done it. I think it was more the speaking part than actually, or maybe because it's the prestige of Radio 1. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, even I when I joined Radio 1, having been on radio by that point for sort of between 10 and 15 years, my first few shows, I was a little bit more nervous, whereas I would rock up at KISS and just not really, not be nervous at all. So I think it's the alien environment, isn't it? I mean, you're clearly very eloquent and more than capable of speaking. It's more the unusual environment. I mean, look at the environment here. It's very calming and, red for some people. It's the opposite of calming. But
yeah. Well, I think it was definitely the Radio 1 aspect. It was Radio 1. It was Friday night. It was, been listening to Radio 1 on Friday nights for 15 years or whatever it was before I went on. So I think I was just building it up in my head, and then on the second time I went on, it was for a Christmas show, and it was nerve-wracking, and I was mixing, and we were all pulling names out of I had to put our next track on, and that was so scary, and I was literally playing in front of Danny and like a few other people that I knew, like Hannah Wanson, but it was just like the most nerve-wracking thing. So that was a question I wanted to ask you. I think I've answered my own question, but you've been doing radio from the age of 19, and when you started pirating, you've obviously carried that through, and it's just, suppose, reps, maybe just reps. I think it's like preparation. Preparation builds at least some degree of lack of nerves. Public speaking's an interesting one, because since I've done my other line of work as a lawyer, I do quite a lot of public speaking because I give lectures at universities and I do various other bits, and I would be very nervous if I got up and, as much as I know quite a lot about the industry as a whole, if I got up with no preparation and no kind of bullet points, I'd be as nervous as the next person. Whereas obviously if you are the presenter on a radio show, you are turning up, you know what you're going to play, you know when your links are going to come in, you know what the structure of your show is. It's much more difficult for somebody coming into that environment on a one-off basis, not really knowing what to expect. So I don't think you've got anything to be ashamed of, that's for sure. Well, I know, I know what you mean, because I've turned up to shows where I've just gone and downloaded loads of tracks, and it was a big show and hadn't really prepared anything. And even though you know your other folders you've had on your USB or whatever for years, still going in and going, I feel a bit uneasy. I haven't actually really done my homework for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to doing gigs, isn't it? I mean, I would say once or twice a year, I do sort of 80 to 100 gigs a year, and I might once or twice a year at the very biggest things where you've got a very short set, I might plan what the first 2 or 3 records are going to be. I would never go beyond that, because it's not in the nature of what I do. You've got to be reactive. But again, it's all about preparation. I know of the new tunes in my box, the things that have come in there within the last month, I know them really, really well before I go out and DJ, because that's what generates the lack of nerves, if you like. Whereas if you were to go and start messing around and testing things overtly, especially in bigger events, it's going to create a nerve-wracking situation where you're kind of on the back foot, and you think something doesn't react quite as well as you expected it to, because you haven't listened to it properly and you haven't worked out where it fits in to the broader context of one of your sets. So yeah, I sound really geeky, but preparation is key in just about whatever you do in life, ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah, this episode is sponsored by Digital Ibiza Rentals, the go-to crew for all your needs in Ibiza. Digital have been the lead concierge service in Ibiza since 2016, and there's a pretty good reason for that too. It's not because they have lovely hair or because they're well-mannered lads. Actually, why are they the best?
It's in the script. They're paying us to say that.
Oh, awkward. Anyway, listen, if you go into Ibiza and you need yachts, villas, private transfers, car hire, club tickets, guest list, or even helicopters, Digital has you covered. And these guys specialize in DJ equipment and sound systems. Listeners of this show get 20% off their first use of the service. Just quote BearChat on checkout and get 20% off. So head over to their Instagram at Digital Ibiza Rentals or to their website, digitalibiza-rentals.com, and quote BearChat to get 20% off. By the way, invites to villa parties are welcomed. Nice one. Yeah, I remember on that, absolutely agree. Chris Williamson said, I don't know whether it was his quote or someone else that he was quoting, but he said 20 minutes of prep in an interview process, and an interview situation adds something like 20 IQ points. That's how he said it. He said, if I do 20 minutes of prep, it'll add 20 IQ points, which is a massive advantage to a conversation, especially if you're going into a conversation where you don't, maybe not know them, you're not friends, you know, you're trying to get the most out of that conversation, podcast, whatever it is. 20 minutes. So like going through if I'm going back to like listening to tracks and in the hotel room before going to a gig, knowing where the breakdowns are, that's easy. You can just look at that in the waveform now, yeah. Right? But knowing actually what the feeling of the track and what style it fits into. I mean, to be honest, like, yeah, in my case, it'd probably be before hotel rooms. There will be a day a week where, you know, there's a transition point in my week, which is a Friday, obviously, where I sort of switch off as a lawyer and switch on as a DJ, and I listen to everything really thoroughly at home, in that home environment, through my same pair of headphones, through my same laptop, so that I kind of know, and try not to add an overload of new records every week to your what you're going to play. Just keep it down to, like, I don't know, between 10 and 20, so that you're not then you become indecisive. You think, well, you know, I've got all these new records, like, which ones do I fit in? Yeah, I think I was doing that quite a lot towards the end of my career. I was feeling that I'd play a gig in London and then I'd be in Ibiza the next day and I'd be like, I have to play a whole new set. I was getting to that point where there was so many tracks coming out. My promo inbox was going crazy. You know, promos were just getting built up to the point where I'm like, I feel like I need to be downloading all these tracks. And sometimes you don't. You just need to stick to your foundations, add new bits in here and there. And I'm just, I just find it interesting. Every DJ I've spoken to has got different plans of attack.
Yeah, and it's also we're all different. My attitude is, you know, we all want to play to the most knowledgeable underground crowd in the world, but we will all, on certain occasions, not play to that crowd. And I will never consider myself to be over and above the vibe of the party. So if I had, you know, within certain constraints, I will always try and play what gets an amazing reaction so that people talk about you, because that's how you keep your career going, isn't it? And
Absolutely.
We love what we do so much that it's really, really important that everybody goes home with a smile. And of course, when you start a set, you can test around, play 2, 3, 4, 5 records, see what works, see what direction the dance floor is going in. But from then, my job is to send people home with a massive smile. You know, it's got to be their night out of the month at the very least.
Oh, I love that. That's a nice little soundbite. I love that. That's great. And I think sometimes you can get wrapped up too much in what other people are thinking instead of just focusing on everyone having
Absolutely.
a nice time.
Do you know what? It's one of my earliest mantras, and it's difficult to do, is do not play to the 2 DJs in the house, play to the 1,500 people in the house.
Yeah. Well, I actually got told something else. I remember, I can't remember who it was. I was in San Diego, and the name will come. I've lost it right now, but she said, "Don't play to it's not like you're yours at all." But it said, "Don't play to the lads, play to the lasses. Play the sexy ones. Play the ones like if you're struggling with the crowd a little bit, play the ones that's got something that the girls will like, because the girls will come to the dance floor. It brings the boys to the crowd." That's what I got told. But anyway, moving on to genres. You know, you've stuck to your guns quite vigorously, which I think is great. And I was speaking to Roger about this the other day. Roger Sanchez was in, and he was saying that music goes around, like, you know, I don't think these are his words, but he said it's like fashion. It goes around in cycles, right?
It does.
And we were talking about longevity. That's what it was. And when we were talking about longevity, he said that one of the things he's the most proud of is he's stuck to his guns and hasn't adapted based on what's cool and what's not cool, and kind of adapted that way. But you're still doing your thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing is, I've always had quite a broad taste. I came from the acid house era. I actually love houseier stuff that's got a bit of groove and got a bit of bang about it. And I love the, you know, hard house and trance. And it's quite unusual to like both. And actually the latter two have, especially the more, what I would call hard house, but that kind of, I don't know, the Hannah Lang sort of sound. Now what Patrick Topping's doing as well has come very much back into fashion. But I've always tried to play a sort of, you know, it's difficult sometimes to kind of combine those different styles. But I just like what I like. I think if you get too bogged down with genres, you know, hopefully your taste is going to coincide with that of the people you're playing to. You can't ask for more than that, really.
No, absolutely. It's. I don't think it's unusual either what you said there in terms of the genres that you like, because I grew up with hard house and trance, and that was I grew up in the northeast of England, so Tidy Boys was huge, and the trance stuff was really big. What you're talking, like, you know, the Tiesto, the Traffic, that sort of stuff. And then as I started going out more, I think it was influenced by the people that you hang out with. So if they were listening, they were going to breakbeat nights. So I was going to see people like
Stanton Warriors,
Plump DJs, Plump DJs, Meet Katie, all that sort of stuff. And that was kind of my not way out of trance and hard dance, but it was something different that I hadn't heard, and I was like, oh, that's nice, and hearing the different grooves. And then I started going to house parties, and then it was, you know, Defected and all that sort of stuff, and then it just opened up a whole new world to me. But it was very much influenced on my surroundings. You know, I'm sure you agree that you are a product of your own environment, really, as you're growing up and as you get older.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I found that very much was a case for me when I was trying to be friends with these groups in Newcastle. They won't mind me saying this, but the guys who ran a party in Newcastle called Jaunt, they were house and techno, Blackhall and Buckless, Tom Rank and all those boys, and they kind of took me in. I sold tickets for them for one party. They did a Circo Loco night in Newcastle at Legends. I can't remember how many years ago this was. And then I saw, you know, like Matthias Tansman and Scalacci and all those guys, and then it was like, what's techno? What is this? Never heard this before. And then the house and techno thing kind of took over for me. But I'm digressing a little bit. But was that a case for you? Was a lot of people around you really heavily into trance?
No, they were into all areas of stuff, really. I wouldn't say I am. I'm more influenced by my background, you know, my DJ background, and some of the clubs I played really early doors. Like I played in Berlin, for example, really early, like in the early to mid 90s, just after the Berlin Wall had come down. And I did this club called E-Work, which was a really early, with that and Trezor were the two kind of flag bearing clubs in Berlin. And the sound there was really hard. And it was the sort of precursor of trance, if you like. And it just opened my eyes to a whole different sound, which wasn't really popular in the UK at the time. In the UK, you'd almost got a kind of divergence between house and then what I would call rave, which kind of went into kind of jungle, if you like. Those, you can draw this kind of really interesting, I don't know, family tree of genres. And then I went over there in particular, and there were a few other places I played abroad as well at the time, and it just opened my mind to a completely different area of music. And I just loved, you know, being a bit of a kind of lunatic. I kind of loved that, and that's what took me away a little bit from the house. But my love for house will always be there, because it's what got me started, and I still play loads of it as well now. It's just, you know, it's a Rubik cube. Any DJ set is a Rubik cube. You know, you're fitting together what you love in the most palatable, logical way possible, meanwhile with one eye on the dance floor. And I relate to that in many ways, but the other way. So when I was going through promos or trying to make edits on the fly, I'd make like trance edits. So I'd whack a trance riff in there on a breakdown where I knew people are going to know and they're not going to expect it. So it's trying to be authentic to yourself, because, you know, taking myself back to my younger roots, listening to the trance and the hard house. I know people who were there maybe at a Defected show. I used to do it quite often at Defected, and obviously Simon Dunbar probably wasn't expecting that sort of stuff at his parties, but it worked, right? Because you catch people off guard, and you still. Yeah, I think it's only certain DJs, in fact, probably the majority of DJs, electronic music DJs anyway, who are get very caught down one particular lane and become. They're not genre agnostic at all. They're very sort of one-track minded, and I've just never been that way. To me, of course, I can't go. I love drum and bass. I couldn't go out there and play drum and bass in my sets, but that's purely because the BPM is wrong, you know. But I just.
But you would if you could.
I would, absolutely would if I could. Yeah. So it's, to me, the only genre should be good and bad. But I understand that, especially for younger DJs who are trying to make their way in an extremely competitive marketplace, that you've got to stick in one lane. You've got to almost ride the coattails of the big DJs in a particular scene. It's not going to work to be all things to all people. But luckily enough, my name is sort of sufficiently well known, certainly to the sort of 35 plus market, that I can get away with that. And it's just how you construct it and play it, really.
I land just on that age bracket. I'm 35, and I think that's bang on. But actually, that leads me on to the next question, which was talking about the younger artists coming through. I wanted to I want to actually, it's probably going to be half the podcast. We're just talking about the legal side of things.
Sure.
And your, obviously you're still DJing, and you said you're doing 80 shows a year still. Yep. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I had
2 on Saturday night, just gone. Yeah.
Just gone this last week. Yeah. Well, that's one thing I want to touch on, which is not juggling, but like managing that side of things, which is obviously late nights and DJing and performing, and then obviously the full-time job that you do, which is music lawyer. Is that
correct?
What you correct? Yeah. So just to bring it back a little bit, we touched base, I would say about 4 years ago. I think it was just before the lockdowns, 2019.
Yeah.
When I can't remember who it was, but they put me in touch with you for an issue I was having. Now, the reason this links into what you were saying about the younger artists coming up is that when I reached out to you, you probably realised I was in a bit of a flap. I looked back at the email that I sent you, and it said, "Please help me," in the subject.
Well, you may as well get to the point straight away.
I thought that'll get his attention. But the reason I want to be open and honest about that is because I was in a position where I felt like I'd been taken advantage of in a way, but I didn't know if I had. And looking back now after everything that's gone on, I feel that there's not, I don't know if representation is the right word, but I don't know if the right guidance is given to music artists, especially in what I was doing, the underground house scene. I didn't feel like a lot of my peers at the time who I'd spoke to about their management and about their agents or whoever it is your team is, if you like, your community, the right advice and guidance isn't given. So I want to touch on that.
Sure.
But first of all, please, could you just tell people who don't know what it is that you do? Because Judge Jules is.
Well, I'm my practice, or I've got some partners in my practice, is called Sound Advice, which is one of the more jovially named law firms. Most law firms is called Jones, Smith and Co. or whatever. No, we're called Sound Advice. We're based in Tileyard, which is Tileyard South, the London version, which is the biggest kind of music enclave probably in the world, enclave of different music businesses. I don't only do electronic music, but 90% of what I do is electronic music. Represent some really well-known artists, some huge legacy artists, some huge new artists. I suppose the bulk of my work, although not all of my work, is recording agreements, music publishing agreements and management agreements, also distribution agreements. Most of it, if you like, is being a priest, initiating blessing over marriages between parties, or making sure that the marriage vows are I'm mixing my metaphors a bit here, making sure the marriage is done on a satisfactory basis as possible. And thankfully, a much smaller percentage of the time is being a divorce counsellor, whereby you're sort of presiding over disputes between people. The reality is that, notwithstanding having seen the likes of Suits and all those kind of legal dramas, most agreements are either successful or dissipate into nothing, if you like, because it just doesn't work without any acrimony, and only a small percentage end up with real sort of hatred between the parties. But if that happens, then I'm there to deal with that as well.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the essence of the deals I do. But because I've done so, I think being an active artist and also having been in so many of those environments myself, been signed to 2 or 3 major labels, actually ran a major label dance imprint for 10 years, have been promoted in Ibiza, promoted at a fairly high level, done loads of stuff. So I think it gives me a slightly different angle on things as compared to a lawyer who's been a lawyer all their life, and they might have gained plenty of experience and knowledge of the industry through doing deals. But actually, I think if you sit in the middle of that existence, it gives you a wholly different perspective because, you know, above all else, it teaches you what's important to fight for and what's not important to fight for. And sometimes one encounters lawyers on the other side who simply can't see the wood from the trees. They just fight over everything, and it wastes everybody's time, slows the deal down, and ultimately costs their client money.
Yeah, a lot of money sometimes. I know that the issues that I was having with it wasn't massive amounts of money, but at the time it felt like everything, and it can feel like you just lose hope, you know. But in terms of the smaller amount of the work you do, which you said is the divorces, if you like, what would you say were the major pain points for people in the underground or the electronic music industry? Would you say
signing, basically being very desperate to get their foot on the playing field and signing really negative management or recording agreements and occasionally publishing agreements as well, and trying to extract people from that situation. Occasionally it's where, well, in electronic music, there's a limited amount of artists who are duos or trios. The majority of artists are soul artists, but, you know, navigating through disputes between artists, you know, band members, notionally, if you want, for want of a better description, comes up quite a lot as well. Name disputes comes up quite a lot because it's really bloody difficult to find an original name now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, in the Spotify era, where you've got tens, if not hundreds of thousands of releases every week, and you're just starting out with your career, how do you find an original name that hasn't been used by somebody before? Because if somebody before has used the same name and they have traded, if you like, released records, had done gigs, or even just had streams in your territory, using the UK as an example, they can come in and say, no, you are not entitled to use that name. And actually, because of the sheer volume of releases, it's very difficult to find an original name now. I mean, you know, if you were to think of a name that you consider to be original and you Google it, you know, name X on Google or name X, stick it into Discogs, you'd be shocked at how tough it is to find something original. And there's a lot of those sort of circumstances where somebody has a hit record. I mean, I had one particular client who had just signed a huge major label deal for like a six-figure sum, and part of the promises you make in your contract, your record label, is that your name is original, that nobody else has got it. The day after it, somebody knocked on the door who was a pre-existing artist with the same name, and you know, it was really nasty. And the problem is, you know, unlike other aspects of what I deal with in legal capacity, which are quite complicated and require a very specialist and experienced brain, the law when it comes to name disputes is quite simple. It's like first shot wins. If somebody else has used that name and they've used it in the country that you operate in particular, you do not have the right to use that name if they choose to go take it all the way against you.
And do they then, would you get a situation like that where the original owner of that name would say, look, I want X amount? Is that what
Well,
you're
in
doing?
theory, they could do that. Normally speaking, it ends up in a name change, but a name change obviously can be very detrimental to an artist. It's hard enough to build up a name and a brand for yourself, let alone when out of the blue, you've got to turn around and change it.
Yeah, no, completely. I had a name issue, but it was completely different to that, and it didn't require legal turmoil. But when I first signed my first record, the label that I signed it to said, "Oh, someone's already got your name on Beatport or whatever it was at the time, so you have to choose a different name." And I was like, "Well, I don't want to choose a different name." I said, I'll just put UK next to it, which is, you know what, I still hate this because it has Jackie UK and when I was playing abroad, it would be like Jackie UK, and it's like, I'm not doing that on purpose, guys. I only did that because I needed to.
Yeah, well, that is the solution in to certain.
Yeah.
If the other artist in question has not got any presence in the UK and they've only got presence in another country, then you can pretty safely do that. But that's it's not an ideal solution, is it? I didn't know. Did you have to use that thereafter throughout your kind of, I don't know, your presence on Spotify?
Well, I did. And then I realised 2 years later, after I got some really big records out, that name wasn't taken. He just put it in Google and it wasn't even checked on Beatport. So then I started to go through all the labels and went, guys, could you contact the distributor and change it? And it was so long and it took months, and then I had 2 profiles on Beatport and 2 profiles on Spotify, right. And it was just messy. But I found it interesting about the name thing because that just came back to me. But I can imagine that being quite difficult if you've built a career on a certain name, then you've got to. Oh, if you want
you'd be amazed how many people are very naive about it. Who the amount of people I encounter who just haven't checked to see whether anybody else has used the name before them.
I didn't.
And it's I guess to be honest, historically, my stage name, Judge Jules, I did trademark for a long time ago. And when the trademark came up for renewal, I was a lawyer by that point. So I thought, there's absolutely no point renewing the trademark because I can fight it using other legal means if I have to. But yeah, if you trademark a name, then you're in a slightly better position. You're not in a completely waterproof position, but you're in a better position. But trademarking your name's not cheap. No. So it's not something you'd want to do immediately in your career.
What does the price of a trademark depend on? Is it all?
Well, trademarks are only valid. Brexit hasn't helped in that respect. In that you would, in the past, you had the European. You'd have a Europe-wide trademark, including the UK. Yeah. You'd now have to do it separately for the UK. To the rest of Europe, so that's two separate costs. You'd have to look at the principal territories, the principal markets where you wanted to go out live in particular. So the US is, the US, and then you'd have to look at other ones. But the more different territories in which you need to trademark your name, the more expensive it becomes. Just to do the EU, the UK, and the US would cost you not far short of 10 grand probably. So it's not cheap. You could do it a lot more cheaply for the UK. But it gets really expensive. So that's why it's not a viable option for for the majority of artists.
Yeah, of course. 10 grand's a lot of money.
It really is.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. See, obviously this knowledge that you've got, it comes from, I assume, your background. You went to uni and did this, the legal side of things. But do you find, or do you think that there is a lack of guidance for artists, or do you think that you shouldn't?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there's certain, you can read around the subject. There are books you can read. And if you are... the irony is that in my experience, many of the most successful artists that I've known in my life, both in and out of the electronic music world, because when I was younger, I came a bit out of the sort of hip hop and the sort of the British urban scene when I was really young. All of them, almost all anyway, the most successful artists I've ever known have been very business savvy as well as being great creators. So I think I think a golden rule as an artist is yes, performing in front of people, making records, that comes from the heart. And to an extent, there's a bit of a conflict between that and going away and reading around the subject and making sure you understand the business. But honestly, it's so rare to be good at one without the other.
Right, yeah, I see that. I think maybe it was some naivety on my part when I first got involved with management and things, because you're just like a deer in headlights. I was so excited.
And you're so... I don't think it's sort of patronising or inaccurate to describe it as sort of... one is so desperate to succeed.
Massively.
Yeah.
And you're getting signed to a management company that's got some of your favourite artists on, and you're like, oh my God. And then you go into a room and they're like, right, this and this, and you sign this, and you're just like, all right, whatever. Like, am I going to get a gigs in Ibiza? I'm going to do this. And you're like, all right, well, cool. Whatever I need to do, I'll do it. Yeah. And you feel that you're getting the best guidance because they're your manager or whoever it is. And I've heard a few stories like that, and I was young, I was impressionable, but at the same time, I was 25, 26, I was an adult, sure. And I should have probably done a bit more due diligence, and I didn't. Yeah,
I think the issue with, and I represent quite a few managers who I really rate, really shit hot, but at the same time, when you are an artist, you have to understand that your manager wants to earn money out of you. So some of the decisions that might not be in your best long-term financial interests are in the manager's interest, because the Achilles heel of any management relationship is that it can be, is the length of the term. So if you're a manager, it's legitimate to want to try and make the money quickly for fear of your artist kind of binning you and going elsewhere in the longer term. And it does happen. And sometimes it happens without any sort of moral or, any moral justification whatsoever, but it does happen. So therefore, it's all the more important to have some degree of understanding about the business from your own perspective. And I'm not knocking managers. I think it's quite natural that managers will want to earn their money in the short term. But I think, that's a very basic point of business principles when you're an artist. Think, is this in my longer term interest doing this deal?
Yeah. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Because at the time when I contacted you, I think I was, again, talking about being naive, didn't do my own research, if you know the cliche, don't do your own research. But I didn't, and I didn't read up on anything. I didn't know how to best represent myself with management. And then, but at the time, I was blaming everyone. It's not my fault. You shouldn't have done this, should have done that, shouldn't have done this. But then in reflection, looking back, a little bit older, a little bit wiser, thought that maybe it isn't their fault. You're responsible as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why so many managers get binned or sacked or terminated before perhaps when they justifiably should, because I think psychologically, and I'm really into the having, being older gives, and being in a very unusual job. I'm not talking about being a lawyer, I'm talking about being an artist and the psychology of being an artist, which is, I think, really interesting, because most successful artists have got some degree of pain somewhere lurking in the background. If you look at the backstory to everybody, it's certainly the case where I'm concerned. And because of that sort of innate pain, if you like, you have to be incredibly thick-skinned, and you have to be very impervious to the knocks, because there are a huge amount of knocks that you're going to encounter. And if you're weak-willed and thin-skinned, it's not going to serve you very well. And it might actually being an artist may not be the role for you. There might be somewhere else in the music industry for you, but that's a different story. So that the sort of the byproduct of that thick-skinned nature that successful artists have to have is, if something negative happens, they almost have to pivot 90 degrees to the right and blame somebody else, rather than looking in the mirror and blaming themselves. So managers tend to get blamed for things that aren't necessarily their fault. Yeah. And I see it all the time. And one of the greatest enlighteners about being a lawyer, in the 12 years since I've been a lawyer, is I spent the rest of my professional life, you have this kind of tunnel visioned view of being an artist, which is you have to be so focused and so, at least superficially very strong on self-belief. Whereas as a lawyer, you've got this view from the mountaintop. So I get to see, you're privy to the intimate details of the relationships between so many significant players within the electronic music world, and how those relationships are prospering. Yeah. And you do see it quite frequently, that managers get a really hard time, sometimes undeservedly. Of course, if you've got a good manager, it should be very obvious. There's a lot of shoddy amateur managers who think it's easy, and of course it's not. But at a professional level, you certainly see artists not, at the level of those really good managers. Some of them get terminated upon very unjustifiably.
Yeah. Yeah, it's food for thought for me, because even on the way in here, thinking about the questions I was going to ask you about our interaction 5 years ago, I've got a slightly different view on my behaviour at the time. Still some mixed emotions, but I definitely feel that my lack of knowledge in the area that I could have done prior to signing any deals or looking at any contracts or picking up the pen and just going, it's lessons learned. So, you can transfer that to any part of your life when you're signing a contract for a car or whatever. These are all things that you can carry through to other parts of your life. It's all transferable. But actually, I wanted to move on to the touring side of things, because I didn't know until you came in here today that you were touring as much as you are. So you've got this very successful career as a lawyer with Sound Advice, which is brilliant. And I'm glad we talked about the day, because I hope anyone, whether it's an artist or not, if you're listening to this, that's valuable information just in that 15, 20-minute segment, because I wish I'd heard that 4 or 5 years ago, or 7 years ago. But the touring side of things, how do you find that balance between what you're doing? Because I assume you're working 5 days a week, right? Or Friday's a bit of a juncture for me between the two. Okay.
I've got a PA who helps me with the DJ side of things, who the most time-consuming element of DJing is listening to all those promos. It's vast. And I've got somebody who I work with who narrows that down to maybe 200 a week that I'll listen to. And that alone, and helps me with putting the podcast together and the radio show and all the rest of it, so that I'm sort of focusing just on the stuff that only I can do, which is basically choosing the final selection of records you play and working out how you're going to play. And then I've got a tour manager. So it's not too difficult. Most of the period I've been a lawyer my focus has been more on DJing in the UK. But the last couple of years, I've started doing more. overseas stuff again. Like I'm touring Australia this year. I've been to a few countries this year, and I'm going to the US at the end of the year. But I don't do anything like the touring internationally that I did before I became a lawyer, because it would be impossible, too tiring. But I've worked out how to do the legal stuff whilst being on the move at least 1 to 2 days a week. I actually live a couple of days a week in the Balearic Islands. I live in Mallorca, and my more mature development from having spent a lot of time in Ibiza when I was younger.
Yeah.
And that's where, so my legal practice is kind of 2 days a week from there, working from Balearic home, 2 days a week in the office, and then the 5th day of the week, Friday, is a kind of a bit of a. But those 4 days a week, I have to work extremely long hours. It can be 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. each day, comfortably.
Right.
Which wouldn't be to everybody's taste.
No, but you love what you do, I assume, as well.
I do. I really, I became a lawyer in the first instance because there wasn't really anybody ahead of me in the career trajectory to give me much of to act as much of a role model with regard to what happens when the DJing stops. Of the sort of better known DJs from my era, there was kind of Oakenfold, Pete Tong, and Carl Cox are the three. Carl and Paul are very busy. Pete is busy doing various things, probably less busy on the touring front of his own choice. But when you've got so little to look at by way of, I think it's a story in its own right. What you're going to do beyond DJing, because I think everybody who's successful at DJing is not going to be doing it forever. So for me, it was all about finding something else where I was still very involved and still in the music business and using all that experience that I gained in a lot of different areas. Fast forward to now, I'm still kind of shocked. I'm still very busy with DJing, but I actually think what I've learned as a lawyer has really helped my DJ career. It's made me make some more sensible decisions. For example, when about 3 years into being a lawyer and I was seeing all these amazing managers, I realized that I don't want to be too rude about my ex-manager, but he'd managed me for a very long time. He'd lost his mojo, just lost his interest. But because of the length of our relationship, I thought, I can't end this. But it just forced me to be hard-headed and say, no, let's start afresh. Let's get somebody new. And it just completely changed things for me. For me, that's almost the opposite of what I was talking about a little bit earlier about how people sack their managers too easily. I really struggled to do that. And actually, I probably should have done it earlier. And anyway, so for me, sort of getting back to your question, it was making the two things work together. The intention was never necessarily that I would still be a DJ and a lawyer now. I'm very pleased I am, because I love DJing, and anybody that's done it to to even 15 people will know just what a drug and what an amazing experience it is. I
used to always say on that note that I'd do the DJ part for free. That 2 or 3 hours, I'd do that for nothing. It was everything else I was getting paid for. Yeah. So I was getting paid to go to the airport on my own and be away from my wife at this engagement party and all this other stuff that I'd miss out on. That's what I was getting paid for. The 2 hours where you play into a crowd, even I would say probably after the first track, because you never know how it's going to go. But after that first or second track, when you just relax into it, I'd do that bit for free. But again, just touching on something that you said there about not touring forever. I spoke to Mark Knight about this, and he said that there's no other job you go for where they go, right, you passed the interview, but this is what the job entails. So you're gonna be away every weekend for 20 years. You're gonna miss this, and this. You're gonna work all weekends, so you're gonna get a weekend off, maybe 1 or 2 here and there. When you hear that in a job profile, you'd be like, what? So treating it as a music business is what he was trying to focus on, and having, I think he called it legs to the octopus, having the different legs. So whether it's a record label, whether it's obviously for you it's being a lawyer, and having those branches.
In Mark's case, obviously Toolroom, his label's extremely successful, so
but he's obviously got a huge label, which now is the top selling label on Beatport. But I think his point was, you're not going to be on the road forever. Doing, how many shows were you doing a week back in the 90s?
Oh, up to 200. No, 200 a year.
Yeah, 200 a year.
Even 250 a year.
250 a year, so that's a lot of shows. And there's no longevity in the business where you're DJing that often. It doesn't happen that often. There's still some people doing it now, but not that often, not as much as that. But the touring, I think it's great that you're still on the road and you're doing it because you love doing it. And that's really important.
I mean, it's funny because I think there's a sort of, on the one hand, the money's good. I'm not pretending otherwise, but I also think it's about staying match fit It's kind of weird. If I, January's always the quietest month, followed by February. Not so bad in February. And when I sort of come back at it on a sort of weekend by weekend basis from March onwards, I always feel it takes me a couple of gigs to get match fit again. To work out what current tunes work and to just be back into the thick of it. So I'm lucky that it's never gone down to significantly anyway below the level that I'm doing at now in terms of quantity of gigs. But I'm a firm believer in match fitness, certainly for me anyway.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Jules, before we wrap up, we have a feature on this show. It's called Pass the Book, and we like the previous guest to pass the next guest a book, but not knowing who that guest's going to be. So I actually forgot to bring it over again. Give me 1 minute. I'm going to grab that book, and then I'll tell you who it's from. So this is an unusual one. This is not one that we'd expect to get, but it's the request of the guest. So the book is Where's Wally? That's for you. And it's from a DJ called Jordan Peak.
Right.
And he's actually a really big fan of yours. So we didn't tell him that it was you who was coming on. But he said he's a massive fan of yours and he's coming to see you in the Isle of Wight, I believe. Have you got an Isle of Wight show?
Yeah, in July. Yeah.
So he's going to come see you there. He said he's a massive fan, so please tell him that. But anyway, that's the feature.
So how do I give somebody else the next gift then?
So you don't know who the next guest is. So after the show, you'll tell me the book. Once you've locked that in, you can't change it.
Yeah.
That'll get passed to the next guest. And I'll let you know how it goes.
And I'll tell you what it's going to be the minute we put the mic down.
Fantastic. Well, Jules, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Jackie, so much.
Thanks. Cheers everyone.
Okay.